SPDR funds are a family of exchange-traded funds traded in the United States, Europe, and Asia-Pacific and managed by State Street Global Advisors. Informally, they are also known as Spyders or Spyders. SPDR is a trademark of Standard & Poor's Financial Services LLC, a subsidiary of McGraw Hill Financial. The name is an acronym for the first member of the family, the Standard & Poor's Depositary Receipts, now the SPDR S&P 500, which is designed to track the S&P 500 stock market index. For a long time, this fund was the largest ETF in the world. SSGA also managed the SPDR Gold Shares, which for a while was the second largest ETF in the world. As of August 2012, they are the first and second largest exchange-traded products in the world. The funds are formulated as unit investment trusts. In 2007, SSGA rebranded its other United States ETFs as SPDRs, including the Street Tracks family and its other flagship ETF shares, the DOW Diamonds, that tracks the Dow Jones Industrial Average. This move united all U.S. ETFs managed by SSGA, a total of 23 at that time, under a single brand. At the end of 2006, the total portfolio that became known as SPDRs had $102 billion of assets under management. As of June 2013, SPDR is the second largest ETF provider, behind iShares, and ahead of Vanguard, with assets of $337 billion. Other funds: in 1995, mid-cap SPDRs were launched by the Bank of New York to track Standard & Poor's S&P 400 index of middle-market equity shares. The diamonds were developed, like the original SPDR, by SSGA in cooperation with the American Stock Exchange. Dow Diamond shares are designed to track the Dow Jones Industrial Average. In 1998, SSGA and Merrill Lynch introduced the sector Spyders, 9 funds which follow the 10 GICS sectors of the S&P 500. Because the S&P 500 contains only 8 telecommunications companies, those companies are a part of the Information Technology SPDR, and that one fund represents those 2 sectors. SSGA also launched a number of index-based ETFs under the brand Street Tracks. These were renamed SPDRs in 2007. SSGA also manages ETFs that are sold on exchanges outside the United States. In Australia, SSGA manages 3 SPDR-branded ETFs. They are listed on the Australian Securities Exchange and are the following: S&P ASX 50 Fund SFY, S&P ASX 200 Fund STW, S&P ASX 200 AREIT Property Fund SLF. Selected funds: Dow Jones Global Real Estate ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, RWO, Dow Jones Global Titans ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, DGT, Dow Jones International Real Estate ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, RWX, Dow Jones REIT ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, RWR, Dow Jones STOXX 50 ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, FEU, Dow Jones Euro STOXX 50 ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, FES, Dow Diamonds New York Stock Exchange ARCA, DIA, tracks Dow Jones Industrial Average, S&P 500 ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, SPY, tracks S&P 500 Index, S&P Biotech ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XBI, S&P BRIC 40 ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, BIK, S&P China ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, GXC, S&P Dividend ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, SDY, S&P Pharmaceuticals ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XPH, S&P Retail ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XRT, S&P Home Builders ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XHB, S&P Emerging Asia Pacific ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, GMF, S&P Emerging Markets ETF. New York Stock Exchange ARCA, GMM, S&P Emerging Markets Small Cap ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, EWX, S&P Midcap 400 ETF, New York Stock Exchange ARCA, MDY, S&P International Small Cap ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, GWX, S&P International Consumer Discretionary Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IPD, S&P International Consumer Staples Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IPS, S&P International Dividend ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, DWX, S&P International Energy Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IPW. S&P International Financial Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IPF, S&P International Healthcare Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IRY, S&P International Industrial Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IPN, S&P International Materials Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IRV, S&P International Technology Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IPK, S&P International Telecommunications Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IST, S&P International Utilities Sector ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IPU, S&P Metals and Mining ETF. New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XME, S&P Oil and Gas Equipment and Services ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XES, S&P Oil and Gas Exploration and Production ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XOP, S&P Semiconductor ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XSD, S&P World ex-US ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, GWL, Barclays Capital 1 to 3 month T-bill ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, BIL, Barclays Capital Aggregate Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, LAG, Barclays Capital Convertible SEX New York Stock Exchange ARCA, CWB, Barclays Capital Municipal Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, TFI, Barclays Capital Short-Term Municipal Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, SHM, Barclays Capital Short-Term International Treasury Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, BWZ, Barclays Capital High Yield Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, JNK, Barclays Capital Intermediate Term Credit Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, ITR, Barclays Capital Intermediate Term Treasury ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, ITE, Barclays Capital International Treasury Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, BWX, Barclays Capital Long-Term Credit Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, LWC, Barclays Capital Mortgage-Backed Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, MBG Bar Cap Street High Yield Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, SJNK, Barclays Capital Tips ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, IPE, Consumer Discretionary Select Sector SPDR Fund New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XLY, Consumer Staples Select Sector SPDR Fund New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XLP, DB International Government Inflation Protected Bond ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, WIP, Energy Select Sector SPDR Fund New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XLE. Financial Select Sector SPDR Fund New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XLF, FTSE Greater China ETF, Gold Shares. New York Stock Exchange ARCA, GLD, Healthcare Select Sector SPDR Fund New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XLV, Industrial Select Sector SPDR Fund New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XLI, KBW Bank ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, KBE, KBW Capital Markets ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, KCE, KBW Regional Banking ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, KRE, KBW Insurance ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, KIE, Material Select Sector SPDR Fund New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XLB, Morgan Stanley Technology ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, MTK, MSCI ACWIX US ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, CWI, Russell Nomura Prime Japan ETF New York Stock Exchange ARCA, JPP, Straits Times Index ETF, Technology Select SPDR Fund New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XLK, Utilities Select Sector SPDR Fund New York Stock Exchange ARCA, XLU. See also, iShares, List of exchange-traded funds, Power Shares, The Vanguard Group. References. External links, SPDRs, Select Sector SPDRs, Australian SPDRs, Hong Kong SPDRs, Singapore SPDRs.